you believe it? It's already the end of January. We're going to bust out the end of January and bring in a great February with some really high good energy and some deep content. And I promise you today, this webinar will be unlike anyone we've had before. We've got some phenomenal guests around a dangerous conversation about something that can truly inspire kids. And that's a conversation around innovations and competency-based assessment. We've got some wonderful people here today. So glad you guys carved some time out of your busy schedules to join us to have some conversation about assessment practices in the classroom. I want to start by introducing myself. My name is Marlon Stiles. I'm a proud partner here at Learner Center Collaborative. We've got some of our teammates here joining us today, but we also have two special guests joining us for the webinar as well. And we just want to take a moment to say welcome. Appreciate you joining us. I'm going to call on my good friend to kick us off first, Miss Liz Perry. Welcome to the webinar. Why don't you tell us all about yourself?
Thank you, Marlon. Hello, everybody. So happy to be here with you today. I'm Liz Perry, Director of Strategic Partnerships with the Learner Center Collaborative. Formerly, I'm also bringing in some of the context from my recent position with San Diego Unified as Director of Instructional Innovation. So as I'm bringing in those examples, just wanted to highlight that. I am on the call today in Colorado Springs, supporting District D11 here currently, but I live in San Diego. And I'm really excited about the conversation today. I truly believe that this conversation about how we assess, provide feedback, and ultimately how we report on students' progress towards proficiency is one of the most important conversations happening in the education space today. So excited to be here with my colleagues and compatriots in the education field and with all of you here in attendance. And I'm going to pass it on to Brianna.
Thanks, Liz. Hi, everyone. I'm Brianna Hansen, Director of Learning Design at Learner Centered Collaborative and a former educator and instructional coach, having done the shift myself from traditional grading to competency-based learning in the classroom and supporting a lot of schools doing it over the last few years. I'm excited to be here. And I'm super, super excited to pass it over to Meg Perry from Embark to introduce herself, and excited to have you all with us today.
Thanks, Brianna. My name is Megan Perry, and I am the Director of Embark Education, which we'll share a little bit more about once we get into the conversation. But we've been partners for a long time with LCC around all things learner-centeredness, including our own competency work. And so I'm really excited to be here to like riff on all the good things that are competencies. And I'm going to kick it to Brian.
Hey everybody, my name is Brian Hayasaka, and I am the very proud head of school at Embark. I am actually in our school right now, which is behind me and is located in Pinwheel Coffee. And so you might see some adolescents moving in and out from behind the scenes. I am the father of two young ones, a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old. And I often think about, we're building the revolutionary model today for students that are in middle school today. But really the dream is that when Maya and Julian get to middle school, this is far more the norm than the exception. And so it's so exciting to have you all with us today and to hear about the work that you're all doing.
Tried to tell you, this is going to be a good one. I tried to tell you. Conversation today is around innovations and competency-based assessment, kind of a flow of events, so you know what's going to happen. Obviously, the chat is live and active. Drop any curiosities, any major takeaways, any wows, wishes, or wonders that you may have. Also, if you've got some questions for our special guests, drop them in the chat. We'll do our best to try to mention those throughout the webinar, fold them into our questions, and if not able to, we'll try to slide some comments or some resources in the chat for you as well. We've got a series of questions. We're going to provide you not with just some insights to what's happening in our big brains around this topic, but we've got some great models, some great examples, some great frameworks, and some great templates for you to consider entertaining in your school communities to engage your learners at your schools, as well as some conversations around some pretty unique strategies that we believe are highly impactful around this topic also. So this is designed to not just talk to you, but really try to elevate your capacity around this conversation and get you excited about really amplifying your ability to embrace these type of assessment practices in your school environment. Brianna, you're going to be up first. If you're ready, give me a thumbs up. Or if you got that customized learner-centered hat that is hot off the presses here, if you've got that, if you want to throw that on. If not, we'll talk about how you can get one of these at a later date. But Brianna, if you're ready to kick this thing off. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. So our first conversation is going to be around a big, giant softball question. As we get through this dialogue, we're going to build on some questions and some content based off of what our guests are saying. Brianna's going to kick us off, and our conversation is going to start around two simple questions. Competency-based learning. Brianna, what is it and why? Let's hear what you got to say.
Great. So this is very far from a softball question. I think this is a big question, and I feel a lot of pressure to answer it. So I'll give my perspective. But first, Marlon knows that I do not have my learner-centered hat because I am not a hat person. So thank you, Marlon, for asking for that. So competency-based learning, I mentioned earlier that I made the shift myself as an educator. And I think, a lot of people use different terms to describe this: proficiency-based, mastery-based, standards-based. They can all kind of fall in this umbrella. We use competency-based learning at Learner-Centered Collaborative pretty intentionally. And when I think about it, think about 3 big shifts. And the first shift is really thinking about shifting from grading or points or percentages on assignments, which can be compliance or completion based, to really focusing on learning and thinking about what are the learning outcomes that we want and how can we assess. And a really key element is give feedback on and show progress towards those learning outcomes. So it's a really big paradigm shift. And I saw in my classroom the shift from how can I get 5 more points or an extra credit assignment to how can I make sure I'm using transition words in my writing so that I can level up in my proficiency. And it really became about learning instead of compliance or completion. So that's one, I think, the biggest shift paradigm wise in terms of competency-based assessment or learning. I think another one that kind of distinguishes competency-based from maybe standards-based is a shift from discrete content or kind of grade level subject specific standards to interdisciplinary whole learner outcomes, competencies that are at a bigger grain size, and really embed the concepts of those content. So content becomes the vehicle to reach those outcomes that follow a learner over time, rather than, you get this and you move on as kind of a checklist approach. I think that's a second shift. And then the third shift I think about, which is really the big one that I think involves a lot of policy and a lot of shifting, not just mindsets, but really those concrete policies, is around measuring seat time to measuring proficiency and really learners moving on based on when they're ready to move on rather than when they've accomplished a specific task. Again, that shift from completion and compliance to really proficiency and growth. So those are some shifts. I think there's a lot more to do and we'll dive into it. But I think with that, I'll pass it over to our Embark guests to really talk about who Embark is as a school and what it means to be competency-based, why that's so integral to your model, and hear a little bit more about how you all interpret that.
Yeah, thanks for that. We've talked a lot about competencies over the years, and there's a lot in the spectrum. And so we're really excited to be able to share like how we've stepped into that space. But just a little, I'm going to share my screen really quick just to like, we put together a few slides, not that there's a lot of them, but so just a little bit about Embark. We are a nonprofit based in Denver that is really about transforming learning for youth and adults using a learner-centered approach. And we do that in a couple of ways. The way we're going to focus on today is in our middle school. We have a tuition-free micro middle school that is comprised of students who represent the city of Denver in as many ways as possible, sort of as many different identity markers and markers of diversity as we can, with the intention of being a model for what's possible and rethinking how we approach learning for youth at the middle school level in particular, as a sort of often forgotten grade level and grade span. We really value middle schoolers as middle schoolers as magical. So we're going to really focus on the role of Embark and the work we do at Embark around competencies. But just to sort of for added context, we also run a small business, the coffee shop, Pinwheel Coffee, that Brian is located in right now. And that is the context for learning at Embark. Our design pillars, one of our core design pillars, is around being embedded in an authentic way. And so Pinwheel Coffee provides us with the environment for real world learning to happen. And then we also really think, when we think about learner-centeredness and even competencies in particular, thinking about how do we support adults in embracing a learner-centered mindset and what the shifts that means for them in the classrooms and schools. And so we also have a body of work that is adult learning. So that's a little bit about Embark. We have these sort of 3 buckets of work. And when we think about competencies, I can give like a little bit of our, like the story of how we came to competencies. When we opened, one of the first things that, now 5 years ago, we've been open for 5 years. And one of the first things that actually LCC helped us do was to create our learner profile. And what we created with that was really a set of aspirational traits. And you can see them here on the screen around being aware and resilient and courageous. And we spent the first year really navigating what it meant to live between the standards, Colorado standards, like where we sort of all have come from, and this truly aspirational space of like these like things that you never arrive at, right? Like you never stop being curious or courageous, and trying to figure out those like teaching and learning and feedback and assessment in that space was a real challenge. And so at the end of that first year, we knew that there was something in the middle. Like there's something in the middle that we're not, that is like the right grain size of thinking about how we're shifting what we're actually, when we think about teaching, learning, and assessment, like what is it that we're actually focused on? And so we spent really the better part of a year trying to come up with where we landed with our competencies. And what that ended up being, and I want to name, like, it's become a space, like it is really the core of who we are and what we do. Truly, like, we're not teaching math, science, and social studies. We are teaching collaboration, communication, quantitative reasoning. And that's the point of feedback that we, that's teaching and feedback. That's where we live. But it was not necessarily straightforward. When we started that first year, we had a list of competencies and we got through like the first 6 weeks. And at the time, my role was as director of curriculum and instruction. And I was in and out of classrooms and I was going, we didn't get it right. These are not right. They do not live anywhere. Like we're not really using these. And so like, we need to scrap this and go back to the drawing board. And what we ended up doing was looking at our learner profile and saying, we can't really teach and assess these things, but there are skills that underlie each of these things. And they're not necessarily one-to-one like correlated, but these are things that contribute to being able to be aware and courageous and a community builder. And so actually with Brianna's help over that year, really like borrowing and stealing from all kinds of really great existing resources to put together this list of competencies, sub-competencies, and indicators that I think we have and we'll share with you. But in the 4 years since then, Brian's going to talk more about this, but we've really come to be like, this is the core of teaching and learning and feedback for us. And it's incredibly powerful tool for learners and adults to shift how we think about what is meaningful in learning.
Sorry, I was too busy reflecting on a couple things that you were saying. There are some things that stood out to me. Was, I don't know who said it, but somebody made the quote about when our learners are ready to move on. Like that's just capturing my attention right now, and it makes me think about what we need to assess, or what are we truly assessing before we get into the conversation about really competency-based assessment. So I want to toss it back to both Brian and Megan, just real fast, just maybe share some insights and thoughts with us about what are you assessing?
So, and if you could present, that would be great. So I'll walk through a little bit of what we're assessing, and I think it starts off by looking at what's behind me. And so if we run a professional coffee shop, this is not a coffee shop that is run by students. It is a professional business, and so we are able to hold our learners to the very highest standards, and that's the context for learning. And so we've had to really dabble with what's the right pace of learning and business to where they intersect. And so what we've landed on are a series of questions that we ask ourselves. What is it that we're doing that students can be doing? What is it that we're doing that learners should be doing? And what are the conditions that we need to create to make that so? Ultimately, that's where the competencies come in. And so down in the bottom left, you're seeing the smiling faces of Embark learners. I was a founding educator, sixth grade educator at Embark, and I still dabble. So I got to lead a learning experience this year. And we were playing with this idea of, the lifeblood of a coffee shop is coffee. But we have never roasted our own coffee. We source from amazing partners. And so we thought to ourselves, is this a project where the pace of learning can match the pace of business? And we decided that it was. And so the next things that we had to think about is, so what is actually happening when somebody roasts? And I sat down, I went to our roasters, and I just followed their process. And what I heard was an incredible amount of critical thinking and also quite a bit of collaboration. And so we built this learning experience around those two indicators. Of course, you see agency up there, which is something that is just core to Embark. But really, we're thinking about developing critical thinking through the lenses of inquiry, evaluation, and conclusion. And so to roast coffee, it's a really iterative process. You get a lot wrong, and you're tweaking one variable at a time. If you think about what I'm saying, there's probably a few scientists in the room who are like, oh, that sounds like science. And it is. We just never tell learners that, because as soon as we start to hit them over the head with the academic word for it, then they're like, okay, this is just school again. But if you just go through this learning experience and say, this is what it takes to roast coffee, by the end, you're like, hey, y'all, do you realize you just did 6 weeks of deep scientific thinking? And they're like, huh, I guess I did. But ultimately, what we're assessing is at the indicator level. And so we're not just having them ask questions, we're teaching them how to ask questions. So you'll see within the Aptitude platform that we use, there's resources, but there's also the competency of critical thinking and inquire. So raise vital questions and problems, formulate them clearly and precisely. That is what we were instructing them to do. If you're going to, start the scientific process, you have to ask the right questions. And no, there are no dumb questions, but there are better and worse questions. And so we've gotten pretty good at instructing that. And as we move through it, ultimately, you'll start to see, but part of the assessment is what they have in their hands. That is professionally roasted coffee. And that coffee it's not even the monetary value of it, which is quite expensive. They roasted 133 pounds, and that cost us a couple $1,000s. So, hey, that's a big investment, but it's also like, you can't screw up coffee in a coffee shop. And so when you tell middle schoolers this, they just change. They're like, oh, got it. They're trusting me. They're trusting me with something important. So I better not screw this up. And actually, that's a pretty good motivator. And in the end, it's not about fear, right? It's about the sense of accomplishment. And you can see that on their faces. Although Vita, with a New York sweatshirt, I don't know what that smile's all about. But generally speaking, they came out of this thing enthused. And so, yes, we're teaching them science. We're teaching them about roasting coffee, but really it was about inquiry, at least in this assignment.
The luxury of being the host, you actually get to punt back to somebody else. And I'm going to do exactly that. Brianna, and Liz, I'm going to slide it to you first to kind of continue that dialogue and build off of what Embark just shared around that same question about what are you assessing? Like, kind of build on that, see where you want to take it.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that I would just love to point out in working so closely with Embark for the last few years is like, there's a key element to like why competency-based learning is so important. And Brian just shared it, which is that the students are learning in this real world context. And so just having like assignments that get a point score on it, or just having even discrete standards is like not going to cut it in terms of really demonstrating what students know. And I think you all have done such a great job of really putting a mark on making it clear what really matters to you, and then actually assessing and showing progress on what matters. So I think just a kudos to that. But I think there's lots of different models. Meg shared that as Embark was creating the competencies, they begged, borrowed, and stole from a lot of different places. We work with, and I've talked to a lot of different models. A lot of schools and districts are working on developing portraits of graduates. And so like Meg mentioned with the learner profile, and then developing out kind of progressions. One example is Logan County that we've been working with for the last few years. I think we'll be able to share some of those examples in the chat with you so you can check them out. But developing out their progressions from different age bands. So not looking at discrete grade 2, but really looking at a grade band of K through 2, 3 through 5, etc. And then other ones, organizations like Building 21 have built out some really complex continuums that build on standards and show kind of growth over time. Again, looking at those bigger grain size of competencies. There's lots of other kind of models out there, but those are two I just wanted to shout out in terms of frameworks you can kind of pull from of what other competencies look like, in addition to the example that Embark shared.
Awesome.
And Liz?
Thanks, Brianna. Yeah, and I'll jump in. I loved kind of hearing the language of, there are spectrums of practice. And I think that Embark was mentioning that. And then also really, these conversations are practices that districts across the country are grappling with. And one thing I want to emphasize is just that there are multiple entry points to this work, and that each system, district, school, as you engage in this conversation, one of the things I want to highlight about San Diego Unified is where they started, because it's a different starting place than maybe some others, smaller organizations or other districts have started, but there are multiple entry points. So one thing I want to also establish is just that what is important about this question of what is being assessed, I think, is that in a competency-based system, we first need to get clear about what the learning outcomes are. So what is it that we're hoping to assess? And that is then what we can kind of anchor our competencies to. In San Diego Unified, it's the second largest school district in the state of California. It's quite large. In 2017, the school district shift its focus in the secondary space to standards-based learning. Some of those practices had been utilized at the elementary level for some time, but this was really a shift for a larger public school system to move into that space in secondary. And that started with prioritizing academic standards for ELA, math, and science. And so really the focus or the entry point for kind of thinking about shifting grading and reporting practices or assessment and reporting practices started with the conversation of the academic outcomes that the district was aiming to achieve. And in that work, the prioritized standards that San Diego Unified developed were strategically grouped and prioritized standards by content area that established like a uniform minimum expectation for end of course objectives. And within those, each kind of prioritized standard had a set of proficiency scales. And in San Diego Unified, we were using a 1 to 4 scale. And that really helped to determine and create clarity around the focus of assessment for our grade levels and for our content areas. I will say that in subsequent years, other content areas, we developed prioritized standards for those content areas with aligned proficiency scales. And then in the summer of 2023, San Diego Unified, which was just this last year, right, not that long ago, the board approved a learner profile with 6 learner profile components or characteristics. So celebrating that kind of advancement, starting place is really looking at the prioritized standards. Now we're looking at what is the intersection of our prioritized standards and these learner profile characteristics, and grappling with those questions in a large school district. So again, there are multiple entry points. Sometimes standards-based learning is the entry point for moving towards more of a competency-based model, but the most important piece of what is being assessed is determining what are the competencies that we're looking for. So.
Yeah, great dialogue. Meg, you got something?
Yeah, can I jump in? I really appreciate, Liz, you sharing that, like, and I just like to highlight a little bit like the multiple entry points and like not necessarily like the spectrum, but like from the Embark side of that, like sort of how we got there. The mission of Embark is to support learners to courageously engage, inquire, and discover a sense of self. And so, you talking about it totally makes sense for a large school district to really ground in like academic outcomes, and Embark having like being in a space of being an independent school and being able to sort of take like focus on the sort of like progressive ends around like if we're focusing on, as learner-centered collaborative does, like what does it mean to be a whole human? And so while like the standards are very much like underlying, they are not for us anyway. Like we have a responsibility, like we don't have a feeder pattern. And so like elementary students come to us from across the city and they leave us and go across the city of Denver. So we don't have, testing accountability, but we do have like accountability to like our learners, our families, and our communities. And, but like really lean in hard to the idea of like, if we're moving away from like standards orientation, like almost as like a proof point of like what is possible when you do that. And so like we're living into that. But I think what's also interesting, just wanting to name you mentioning about proficiency scales, we and I believe, yeah, it was shared somewhere along the way of like our competencies, like we begged, borrowed, and stole. So I like sharing with you all also like the what we've put together. And so we have an identified competency, we have sub-skills under each of those, and then we have indicators. But the way that we think about them is really in a holistic way of, you know, a 6th grade learner comes in and we get to know them and we see and are able to chart their progress over time on different indicators, sub-skills, and the competency as a whole. And so we have a 3-point scale. And the very next year, they might end up in 7th grade being we now have different expectations of that learner as a 7th grader. And so even though they may have gotten to the top of that proficiency of our 3-point scale, it's well, now we know what you can do and what's next for you. But not in a measured sort of rubric of here are the progressions. So it's just another interesting approach of how we can hold competency and progress over time.
Something else that just wanted to add in a little bit. So my personal background has been serving in a variety of schools, but low income public school to magnet, dual language Montessori to private international and now Embark. And I've had systems of accountability at every level. They've all felt different, but I have never had more accountability than I currently do at Embark. And I think it's kind of counterintuitive in a sense, but when you're serving 30 learners and their families and you're pitching them on kind of a wild idea, then you damn well better get it right, you know, because you know these families intimately and they know you, and you're telling them, I got you. We have your kids here. And it's not some number on a page. And so the amount of accountability that I feel here is immense. But also the amount of assessment and feedback we give is unlike any other place I've been before. And I know we're going to dig into that in a second, so you'll see it. But I think, you know, there's this misnomer, and I don't mean to suggest it to anybody in this crowd, that, you know, that accountability comes from tests. It's absolutely not. Accountability comes from our learners and our families. And it comes from our internal compass. And I think that's a space that I would seek to elevate in this conversation around competencies as well.
I want to move our conversation, right? There's such rich conversation happening right now. I want to give our panelists a chance to really pour into our guests. And what I'm going to ask you to do is, I want you to pull out some examples. I want you to pull out some models. I want you to pull out some templates. Anything that you can share to pour into our guests is really what I want to really challenge you to dig into. So the conversation so far has been why and what is competency-based learning. The conversation has been, what are you assessing? So now I want to push us into a conversation about what do the assessments actually look like? And again, I want to pull out examples from our Embark guests, but also Brianna and Liz. And our Embark guests are on fire right now. So I want you to kick us off with some examples and really showcase some of those showstoppers for our guests, please.
I know Meg's about to present, and I'm going to just kind of keep you on that same trajectory. So sticking with that coffee roasting project. So our learners, they manage their own schedules here, and they typically have around 10 assignments a week over 5 days, which doesn't really sound like very much. But you'll see in a second, there's a lot of background work happening. So I'll walk you through our cycle. Every Friday, generally speaking, the learners have to turn in all of their assignments. And so much like adults, they've got their workload that they're managing throughout the week. They're scheduling time with educators, a shop shift behind me, time with their colleagues. And then using our Altitude platform, here we go. You're going to see our competencies on the left, our top left. And you're also going to, so they'll give their response. And the educators every single week are going in to provide feedback that is specific, timely, and actionable. And so we do this on a 3-part scale. So practicing, not quite there yet. Meeting, okay, you got what we're expecting of you, but there's more. And extending, which is pretty rare. And so extending are those E's. And if they're not grades, right? Again, there's still some level of motivation, but really where the magic happens is in the feedback. And so we've worked really hard to make sure that they're not just getting, they're not getting feedback at the end of a learning experience when they can never use it anymore. There is nothing more frustrating as an educator in a public setting than to get a state test back in August. When those kids are gone, like, great, what am I supposed to do with this that's actually going to help the learner? So we put a lot of time into giving them feedback that they can use and then holding them accountable to using it. And so up top, you'll see the timeline of their assessments of critical thinking. You'll see that the blank circles, the empty circles, are formative assessments. So those don't count towards their final score, but they're loaded with feedback. The filled-in circles are summative grades. And so over the course of this learning experience, you would have seen 3, 6, 8 scores. This is called Altitude. And so Altitude is a platform that we've been using almost since our inception. And what I think is also interesting is while I was leading this learning experience as an educator, I had a counterpart who was teaching something different. And both of our scores were feeding into the same competency. And that happens. So every educator is feeding into the learners' ultimate scores and their progress reports. I think that's a pretty stark difference in how most schools operate, where you have a course and you're in charge of that grade book. And so you actually build this common practice across your teammates that you have to trust each other, that you are giving solid feedback, that when I say practicing, it means roughly the same thing as when Meg says practicing. And I'll tell you, like, when I mean this at this level of accountability, it's the kind of accountability you want. You want the accountability that says, here's what you're doing well, here's how I see you can improve. And after the fact, okay, you did improve, and so let's keep going. It's very much in the growth mindset orientation. So that is, I think, what I would offer. Oh, and down in the bottom right, this is interesting. So we sold those bags of coffee. This is from our business account at Pinwheel. So the Embark blend and the Pinwheel blend were coffee that was roasted by learners. That coffee by itself, this doesn't include our espresso or other drinks that were made with it, generated over $1,000 in revenue. But it also is just like it's sold out faster than any coffee we've ever had. Made the same profit margin, and our families were like, "Can you please roast it again?" And as it turns out, minor secret here, but Embark might be opening a roaster based on a proof of concept that the learners showcased for us. So in terms of how we assess, there's what we assess for the learners, and then they also get this level of assessment from the actual work they did. It's pretty powerful, and so we show this to them, and they see people coming in to buy their coffee beans, and what a great validation of their work and effort.
And just like to add on real quick, and then want to kick it to someone else. But this idea of like, what are we assessing? There was no grade for the coffee, right? Like getting to the point of like the final product, so to speak, in like a project-based world was the creation of the coffee, and putting that on sale and like having, it served in the shop. And it was getting to the point of roasting professional grade coffee that really was the assessment. And that thing never got a grade, if that makes sense. So all of the work along the way that led to, like, sort of Brian's been highlighting a little bit of a thread with some of the things that he's sharing, like the thinking that went into the creation and the revision to get to a professional level coffee blend is what was assessed. But the thing itself was like, is it good enough to sell? Period. Like, and then that's often where we're able to live in our work, is like, is this professional level work that we can sell, in the world? And one thing I just want to say about middle school, Brian talked about the speed of business and the speed of learning. And one of the things, and like, is this a thing that learners should do, is oftentimes the intersection of speed of business and the speed of learning means that it's a thing that we can spend the time on, right? Like our barista team, our management team in the shop, it might take them a week to do something that it takes 6 weeks for learners to do to get to a professional level standard. And so that's like the thing we try to crosswalk, is like, how do we figure out whether this is a thing that like the adults should just do because we need it done in whatever, in a particular way or in a particular timeline, or is this a space where there's room for learners to explore? So I just wanted to like add that little bit of context.
I'd love to build on that too, Meg. I think, what you're talking about, what I mentioned in the very beginning, which is that shift from like, here's an assignment, or, oftentimes you see like a product rubric, like, do you have all of the requirements of this product, versus a real shift to like focusing on the skills and the learning and the competencies, and the product is the outcome. And there's this really authentic audience and purpose for that product and that learning that has a different what's accountability, like you mentioned, than the grade, that like that's the only reason that we're doing this assignment. So I think those two things go hand in hand. It's hard to do the shift. Like a lot of the questions that come up with that shift are around that, like, will students do it, or will they like do it to fidelity? And so you're talking about that added piece of that authentic audience that allows accountability outside of a grade. And I think that's super important to this conversation.
I wanted to add again, like I'm like celebrating Embark and like to create these aspirational, like to move towards the aspirational, to then show a model of what is possible is I think fantastic. So I'm really celebrating that and love all the examples and the connections. I'm also thinking kind of about this, like, sometimes we look at that aspirational state and think, but I'm here, right? And how do I start moving in that direction? And so again, just thinking about like, what are some of those entry points for folks moving in the direction towards, and Brianna was naming some of the pieces of that. And I think it can come from designing kind of more authentic assessment opportunities. And then one of the other pieces that we looked at was just like kind of building a body of evidence and really stressing the importance of it being first, quality is it assessing the things that we're aiming to assess, but the multiple and varied opportunities for students to show their learning over time. And for me, I think that really is a place to start. Like, how can we increase the multiple and varied opportunities for learners to share their learning and over time? So really giving them the opportunity to bring in their strengths, to provide them with opportunities that are not just tests and quizzes, but that move into the spaces of performance-based assessments, project-based learning, where students can bring in their strengths to show their learning in ways that are authentic to who they are. So when you're looking for those entry points, I think too, thinking about, how do we move in that direction of more multiple and varied opportunities that help connect students to showing what they're learning in their competencies over the course of time, not at a single point.
Liz, let's kind of piggyback on that idea of learners showing their learning over time. Let's talk about how we as leaders or school officials or school community might be able to show progress towards the outcomes over time. Again, I want to push on our panelists to keep sharing examples, templates, or even just major things that are on your mind or projects that you're working on to help our audience members. And I think Nicholas dropped a question in the chat before, just around this idea of just sharing your progress around this whole movement and how you're showing that progress over time. So I don't know who wants to start that off, and maybe just stick with the theme and, have Embark jump in first and kind of share some examples around how you're sharing progress towards the outcomes.
Sure. So I'll continue forth here. So we operate in trimesters, and thanks, Meg, for zooming in there. And so you'll see a couple things progress over time. So you can see in the screen at the bottom, you've got the scores from trimester 1, 2, and 3. And that's over one grade level. And this is for an actual learner. We just took their name out. Same with the feedback above. So you'll see they've maybe had practicing and moved to meeting, but they also may have moved from meeting down to practicing in some areas. And so it's not linear. I think the point we know is progress isn't linear. And so it kind of, in showing it this way, it takes away that comfort that we have, and leads us into a state of discomfort where we say, yeah, sometimes I wasn't thinking as critically or collaborating as well in the third trimester, as opposed to thinking I always have to peak at the end. I mean, of course that's optimal, but isn't always the case. So grades are one thing, but then we spend a lot of time pouring into narratives. And so, Meg, if you go to the next slide, we write a narrative for every learner based on every learning experience. And so generally speaking, we highlight what happened in that learning experience, and we focus on 2 competencies at a time. And we talk about what went well for that learner with regards to that competency. And similarly to what we do at the end of the week, where are there areas that they can do even better? So that last paragraph you'll see is a full paragraph just on this one learner's critical thinking, both what I saw as her educator and where I think she can improve. And interestingly, I mean, the feedback that we get here is just, whoa, you really know our child. And I think ultimately as parents, that's a huge piece of this, right? Like we want to know that our child is known, is seen, is heard, is valued, and is pushed. And so we're reporting this progress out both to families and to learners. So they're getting their grade, if you will, the score, which we don't really care that much about, to be quite honest. And then they're getting these narratives. So over one trimester, they will get 4 or 5 narratives from the educators. And so it's long. It kind of reads like a book in some ways. And so we do dedicate a lot of time to doing this. And then Meg, if you go back, just to keep the professional thread going, we report out to our community. So that's an actual social media post from Pinwheel Coffee promoting the Embark, the Pinwheel blend. And it's just one more way for our community to stay engaged with us. Pinwheel does not advertise that we are a school-run business, because we're not. In fact, like, a lot of our customers are like, what the heck are these kids doing in here? And it becomes like the worst kept secret in Denver. But we do want to report out, because many of them keep coming back because they think, well, I can get great coffee, at 3 places in the neighborhood, but this great coffee supports a learning environment. And so they get pretty pumped to be able to support the work that we do as well. And so how much time do we spend? So I've done it myself, and I think initially it can be a lot, to be honest. And I've been looking at ways to simplify it. I've been looking at, like, what does it look like to put frames out there, to use some form of AI. And I think ultimately the question becomes, what's the purpose? What's the purpose of these narratives? And so we do pour into them quite a bit, because the purpose is to demonstrate that we know our learners, we see them, and here's how we think they can grow. But we're definitely evaluating constantly. Okay, if this took me, so I'm pretty efficient, I can do them in a couple hours. But if you have educators who are not quite as efficient, it might take them a couple days. And so I'm working on trying to narrow that time frame down so that the spectrum isn't a couple hours to a couple days, but maybe is like a half day. And that I think is sort of the dream state. And I know Meg is going to report out or talk about how we report out, because as an independent school, our accountability looks different, but that's something we're currently working on, is how we report out to the larger world. So Meg, I'll send it over to you.
Yeah, I think as Brian was saying, we have a high degree of accountability with our families, obviously, and also, like, in being in the world in this way, right? That is maybe like more on one end of the spectrum than another. There's the space of, like, our own credibility around, like, in the work we're doing, how do they leave us? Like, where does that go if we're, like, not thinking about grades, and we're not someone's question around, like, do we have 7th grade math? We do not have 7th grade math. They don't get a 7th grade math score. They get a quantitative reasoning score every year or every trimester. So they have, I don't know, what is that, 9 quantitative reasoning scores over the course of their time at Embark. And so we have a high degree of accountability of the impact that we're having on learners as individuals and over time. And it's a thing we're really leaning into around, how do we capture quantitatively and qualitatively what happens? So we know, because we are a tight-knit community, we often are in touch with them and know that, they go on from, in sort of a progressive math context to do really well in traditional math settings, because we're really cultivating learner-centered, not learner-centered, but like mathematical mindsets. And so and problem-solving skills. And so when they sit down in a class and it's like, here's the formula, like, that's a thing that they know how to problem solve for. And beyond that, they have a really high degree of agency and trust in adults, that adults are here to support them, that their educators are here to support them. And so anyway, but working to put together truly a body of evidence, we actually have our first 8th graders, who were, like, in our very first year, we had 8th graders, and those 8th graders are now high school seniors. And so we're in the process of collecting a body of evidence and of our impact over time, both quantitative and qualitative, to pick up on the anecdotal stories that we know that we have around how successfully learners transition from an Embark context back into a traditional environment. But it's a little bit of a challenge of, like, we're really trying to live in a different space around learning in particular. And so one of our challenges is, like, actually, what does that look like for us to capture our impact in a values aligned way, right? With a mission and vision that is about learners courageously engaging, inquiring, and discovering a sense of self. Like, what does that actually look like for us to be able to say, here's how they go on from us in a way that both represents who we are and our values, and speaks externally to like a more traditional context. So that's a work in progress, but stay tuned. One of the things that we have done, actually, one of the other fellow travelers in our space is Transcend, and they have a student voice survey around their leaps, which are very much sort of 21st century school transformations, and very much about the learning environment as opposed to like the experience of learning around competencies. But we have a couple of years of data of our students really reflecting back to us that they experience our environment like as we intend it to be, which is really validating. So just like there's another layer of like accountability for the school and like how we assess and share progress for the learners, but also then as a school.
Brianna, we're going to pull it out of you. I know you've got a big project you're working on. You're doing some really dynamite work in this area around sharing progress, just sharing models. Can you talk to us about what you've discovered, what you're finding, what you're working on? Just kind of talk to our guests about that, please.
Yeah, so we've been working with lots of different schools and districts on thinking about these questions around what are your competencies. We support schools with developing portraits of a learner, but also what does it look like to actually show growth and report out on these outcomes, shift away from traditional grades. So we're working on what we're calling the competency-based reporting playbook, and we're hoping to publish that this summer. We're in the kind of early research phase. Embark is going to be a great example to have in the playbook as well, but we're looking and talking to a variety of different schools and districts around what are they assessing, how are they assessing, similar questions to what we were talking about today, and how are they reporting. And so I know there's a lot of questions in the chat around like ratio and what does this look like in an independent school, and the hope of this playbook is to show, Embark is a great example that we're sharing in this webinar. And there's also a lot of other different models and tools. They shared about Altitude as a platform. There's a lot of other tools out there as well. And so that's the goal of this playbook that, like I said, we'll be publishing this summer, to really highlight hopefully 15 or more examples. If you feel like you're an example, I hope that you will send me an email. Maybe we can throw my email there in the chat. So that you can, give me your information and we can highlight you as well. But I think some things that I'm realizing out there is like, one, why we wanted to have this webinar. Not a lot of people know what a lot of other people are doing. Everyone I talk to kind of knows what they're doing and maybe what one other example is doing, but they don't really deeply know what other people are doing. And so just providing a space for that. Although I would love to just like bring a bunch of people together in a room. So maybe that will also be forthcoming soon. But I think that's one big thing, is like this is happening in silos, and just so how can we share that? Embark talked about being a middle school. So, but we've talked to a lot of systems, middle schools and high schools, that are fearful of change because of the next level. How do we get them into high school, or how do we get them into college? Being accountable to your families, right? And that's a big shift and a big fear that stops change, or that is a huge challenge for change. I think two great systems that are working on that are Mastery Transcript Consortium, which I'm sure many part of this webinar know of, but we'll kind of share one of their resources. They're looking at replacing the traditional high school transcript, and another system doing that is One Stone, which is looking at creating a different high school transcript. Both of those systems are having schools that are applying to colleges without grades in their transcripts and successfully getting into those colleges. So I think, it's working from like the ground up and also down is what we're seeing. So that's exciting. And then I think the other challenge, which we mentioned before, is technology. There's been a lot of questions in the chat. What's the tool you're using? We have other tools. That's a big, that paradigm shift from my course, my grade book, to really looking at following progress with a learner is a huge technology shift, in addition to training for educators and really mindset shifting. So those are a few kind of random thoughts on what we're working on, but really, really appreciate Meg and Brian sharing, kind of the Embark example. Like I said, we will be highlighting that in the playbook, as well as many other examples. And if you have an example you want to share, I think my email is now in the chat, and would love for you to reach out to me.
Woo! Woo! A little bit of foreshadowing there, Brianna. If I picked up on what you were putting down, be on the lookout for some information around possibly just a conversation in person of some folks getting together to just chew on this topic and really contribute to that playbook. Just want to double down on +1 that in the chat, you'll find Brianna's email address. Reach out to her if you have some model strategies, examples that you believe are just high level dynamic content to really contribute to the playbook. We're always looking for additional partners to jump in and contribute and just engage in dialogue with the team. Brianna's doing a fantastic job leading the conversation. I want to give her kudos for all the hard work. I want to give our Embark team kudos for just being a model for us to really inspire to be like, so we can impact the learners in our school community. Ladies and gentlemen, our time is coming to a close. A tradition here on Learner Center Collaborative Webinars is closing comments. It really sounds really creative, but it's just closing comments, right? So let's jump to closing comments, and then we'll share a few things that will close us out here. We're going to open it up to our guests. We'll give you 60 seconds each. What's on your mind, anything education related, or stay on this topic. Big takeaways, closing comments to inspire our guests as they walk away here. I'm slowing my conversation down to give you time to think. Some of us were looking up at the ceiling, so that was a hint to me, but closing comments here. Anybody want to jump in first? If not, I'll wait 5 seconds and I'll call on someone. Closing comments. First up, coming to the stage, Meg, I won't call on you. Liz Perry, any closing comments you want to offer us here?
Right. Oh my gosh. I thought it was Meg for sure, but no. Okay. A change up last minute. I think what I'm celebrating, one is just, I think a lot of the questions that I got while working in San Diego Unified were like, what does this look like at the end? Like, I just need to see it in order for me to get there. And so really loving and appreciating seeing the Embark model and pioneers in this space who are taking bold steps to showing and trying on some of these practices that really are learner-centered and support learners in really focusing on learning as the outcome, not on the grade. And so really appreciating seeing the models and understanding that we can move in this direction, even if from wherever we're starting, whatever entry point we're using or whatever next step, that there's a lot to learn from what's happening in our community and from collaboration opportunities like this. So gratitude to the Embark team and to all of you sitting in this space, listening to this webinar, who are thinking about competency-based learning and leading that work in your spaces. So appreciate it.
Next up, Brian.
Man, I was typing a comment to Andrea in that Q&A. You got me. I think that, we talk about this all the time, but the learner-centered school community cannot be this small. It needs to exist for all learners and as rapidly as possible. And so to the extent that you have the ability to impact that, I thank you. I mean, as I said at the beginning of this call, I want for this to be the norm, not the exception, whether it's for my children or others. So thanks for everything you're doing. And if we can help you along your journey, please reach out to us because we're in it.
So glad you're here today, Brian, as well. Brianna up next.
I was gonna say, can I jump in with my closing comments? Because to build on Brian, I think that my takeaway is we need way more than an hour to keep talking about this. I told Megan that I wanted it to be longer than an hour, and she said I was the only one. So for those of you who have additional questions, I would take Brian up on his offer to reach out. I would take us up on our offer to reach out and just keep asking the questions and keep trying to be involved, and we'll have more opportunities for that too.
Best for last, Meg.
Yeah, I don't know, what's left to say. I mean, I think for me, the power in focusing on competencies is that it's like, if you're starting with assessment, then it requires you to answer different questions along the way, right? Like if you're thinking about skills in the way that we approach them around critical thinking, communication, collaboration, etc. It then forces what's happening day to day in the classroom on the ground to change, which is really where, for all of the work in all of our systems, there's, yes, 100% enabling conditions at the school level and at the district level, but there's this space of what is it we're doing with learners on the day to day that changes their experience and sort of their experience of learning and their outcomes. There are multiple different entry points, but in a competency space around here's what we're saying, beginning with the end in mind, it forces you to answer all of the other questions differently. And there aren't necessarily, I think there are sort of there are no dumb questions. There are no wrong ways, but there are, better ways that lead to deeper engagement in learning for individuals. And so I think competencies are a really exciting entry point to have a conversation about everything that comes before them.
Fantastic. It's been a phenomenal webinar. Truly enjoyed it. think I need a new pen because I ran out of ink. To bring us to a close here, just a few things for you to share. I'm going to call on somebody here in just a few moments to share some comments. I want to start by saying if you are interested in elevating the capacity of the staff in your school community, check out Learner Center Collaborative's online courses. We do have a competency-based pathway that really offers you some great professional development and really invests into the capacity and the skill sets of your staff. I do want to call on Brian real fast. If you just want to share, I hear you got a pretty unique Embark event that's coming up. I'm going to give you a chance to drop an infomercial here before we come to close here.
I always wanted to be on an infomercial. So we know that we've had so many visitors come through our spaces, and it's often like spur of the moment. And so we designed something much more thoughtful. And so we host an embedded learning experience twice a year. We have one coming up in February, at the end of February, early March, as you're seeing there. We'd love to have you to experience our school, but also to get more time with our team, to get space to think creatively, to challenge systems, mindsets. And so we'd love to have some of you join us this time around. There's a few spots left, like 5 maybe. And if not this time, like, please join us in the fall when we host it again.
Right. Check that event out if you get a chance. Again, just the idea of just partnership, collaboration, and connection is what we're all about here at the Learner Centered Collaborative and our community as well. Just a quick reminder for our guests who are here today, you will get a follow-up email with the recording and the link to today's conversation. That way you can slow your thinking down and kind of chew through some of the major takeaways that you've had. I want to take a quick moment and promote our upcoming webinar here at the end of February. Be on the lookout for information around our next Learner Centered Collaborative webinar on February 28th, 4:00 p.m. I'm going to stay on the Eastern time for those of you folks who have to figure out what that means when you're on West Coast. To bring us to a close, I cannot end this webinar without saying a huge thank you to a couple people. I want to thank our guests from Embark Education for making a special appearance today. Really appreciate the knowledge that you dropped on us today and grateful for your time. My partners in crime, Brianna and Liz, some of the best in the business, learn from you every single day and just appreciate what you do for the field of education. And last but not least, behind the scenes, she's going to yell at me for saying this later, but Ashley, you make this happen. Appreciate all your hard work and really creating a platform for educators to convene and think together about what's possible for our learners. Rob, I'm just like you, inspired by our panelists today. I'm inspired by you out in the field. On behalf of the team here at Learner Center Collaborative, to all the educators across the country, we just want to say thank you for your service. Have a great rest of the week. Have a great second half of the school year and continue to do great things for our learners. Take care, everyone.